The Hall of the Nine Silences had been built to make speech feel like a mistake. It was 900 feet of black stone under a vault of hanging glass, and every surface in it had been tuned, over 4 centuries, to swallow sound. A whisper died 3 paces from the mouth that made it. A shout traveled perhaps 20 feet before the walls ate it. The architects had done this on purpose. In the Kessari understanding of government, noise was the first symptom of disorder, and the cure for disorder was a room that made noise impossible. On the day the human detail was expelled from the Spire of Anhal, 406 members of the Kessari court stood in that room in perfect, engineered quiet, and watched a boy walk up the aisle to be thrown away. His name was Daniel Ruiz. He was 22 years old. He was 5 feet 9 inches tall in a hall where the shortest noble present was 6 feet 11, and he was wearing the only formal clothing he owned, which was his work uniform with the soot brushed out of it, because the humans had not been given ceremonial dress and had not thought to ask for any. His boots were the loudest thing that had happened in the Hall of the Nine Silences in 200 years. The walls tried to eat the sound and could not quite manage it. Every step he took arrived at the dais half a heartbeat late, like a knock on a door nobody intended to answer. At the top of the aisle, on the 9th step of a stair with 9 steps, Queen Vishith Kessar sat and watched him come. She was not cruel. That was the thing people got wrong about her later when they told the story badly. She was not cruel at all. She was simply the inheritor of a system that had solved a terrible problem 300 years ago and had never once, in all that time, been asked to look at the price. To her right stood Lord Roos Ka-Severin, Minister of Containment, holding the writ. To her left, 1 step down, in the place reserved for the blood of the house, stood her daughter. Princess Ilthara Kessar was in her 24th year, which among the Kessari meant she had been an adult for 11 months and was still being introduced at functions as though she were furniture that had recently learned to talk. She wore the gray of the house. Her throat light, the soft internal glow that Kessari carry under the jaw and cannot control any more than a human can control a blush, was banked so low it was almost out. She had not spoken in public in 11 weeks. The court had noticed and had decided, collectively and without discussion, that the princess was in mourning for her dignity, which was a polite way of saying that everyone assumed she had done something embarrassing and been quietly corrected for it. Danny reached the base of the stair. He stopped where the floor was marked for stopping. He did not look at the queen, because he had been told 40 times that morning not to, and he was a person who followed instructions when the instructions did not require him to abandon anybody. Lord Rusk unrolled the writ and began to read it in the flat, carrying tone the hall was built to permit, the only voice in the architecture that was allowed to survive. By finding of the Chamber of Containment in the matter of the Ninth Terrace event on the 11th day of Sevrek, the auxiliary detail designated sublevel recovery of the human signatory is found in violation of seal integrity. The detail is dissolved. Its members are removed from the roll of the accord and from the body of this station. The named individual, Daniel Ruiz, is held to personal answer for the breach and is remanded to the chamber for disposition. Remanded to the chamber for disposition. 6 syllables and 2 more, and everybody in the hall knew what they meant, and not one of the 406 said anything, because the room was built so that they would not have to. Rusk lowered the writ. He looked, for a moment, entirely satisfied, the way a man looks when the last brick goes into a wall he has been building for a long time. And then on the 8th step, the princess moved. She did not hurry. That was what the witnesses all agreed on afterward, in the hundreds of accounts that were taken and cross-taken and eventually sealed. She came down the stair the way she had been taught to come down it, 1 step at a time, spine straight, hands empty. The court watched her descend with the mild interest of people watching a scheduled thing occur. She reached the floor. She crossed the 6 paces to the human, and then she stopped being a princess and did something with her body that the Hall of the Nine Silences had not been designed to survive. To understand why 406 Kessari nobles came off their feet at once, why the walls failed for the first time in their history, and the sound of that court went up into the glass vault like a struck bell, why Lord Roos Kasevrin dropped a writ he had spent 11 weeks writing, and why the Queen of the Kessari sat on the 9th step with her mouth open like a woman who had just watched her house catch fire, you have to go back. You have to go back 11 weeks, to the 11th day of Sevrek, and to a boy who had been told his whole working life that he was a garbage collector. The Spire of Anhal was the political center of a civilization that had spent 400 years deciding, very carefully, what it was willing to lose. It rose 11 kilometers out of the equatorial shelf of a world the Kessari had terraformed until it agreed with them, and it held 9 million people in a stack of terraces that got wider and dimmer and hotter as they went down. The top 4 kilometers were court, ministry, archive, and garden. The bottom 7 were the terraces, fabrication decks, atmosphere plants, water reclamation, the vast humming guts of the thing, where the actual work of keeping 9 million people alive got done by about 2 million people the court had never met. The Kessari were a tall species, silver gray, plated at the shoulder and the spine, elegant in a way that made humans instinctively straighten up. They were also, in one very specific respect, catastrophically fragile. They could not breathe smoke. Not for long, not at all, not the way a human could take a lungful of bad air and cough and keep working. Kessari respiration ran through a fine filigree of dorsal vents that also served as their heat exchange, which meant that a Kessari in a burning room was being poisoned and cooked through the same organ at the same time. 90 seconds was the number. 90 seconds of real fire environment and a Kessari was finished. There were no exceptions. There had never been an exception. In 400,000 years of Kessari history, no Kessari had ever walked out of a fire. And so, at some point, in the reasonable way that reasonable civilizations do reasonable things, the Kessari had stopped trying. They called it the sealing doctrine. It was elegant. When a section burned, you sealed it. You closed the blast frames, you vented the atmosphere, you starved the fire of everything including the people, and you recorded the loss. The doctrine had a mathematics attached to it, and the mathematics was flawless. An unsealed fire in an arcology killed thousands, and a sealed fire killed only the ones already inside. Every Kessari child learned the numbers. Every Kessari adult accepted them. The Ministry of Containment was the most respected body in the government, and its officers were not thought of as executioners. They were thought of as the people who did the arithmetic so that nobody else had to. The Kessari had a word for a burning room. It was a beautiful word, ancient, with a soft fall at the end of it, and it meant, roughly, the place that is finished. They did not have a word for going into one. The humans had 11 words for it, and 6 of them were profanity. Humanity had been a signatory to the accord for 19 years, which made it the youngest and least important of the 12 species at the table, and its presence on the Spire of Anhal consisted of 1 consul, 1 trade attaché, 4 clerks, and a 6-person crew with a locker on Terrace 16, and no political existence whatsoever. Officially, they were the sub-level recovery detail. Officially, their job was to enter sealed volumes after the fires were out and the atmosphere was back and remove what the doctrine called residue, which meant debris, structure, and bodies. It was the job nobody else could do, because nobody else could work in a space that had recently been on fire without dying in it, and because the Kessari, who could not do it, had convinced themselves it was not a job at all. It was cleanup. It was janitorial. When the court thought of the humans, which was almost never, it thought of them the way you think of the machine that scrubs a floor. Mari Vega had run the detail for 6 years and had stopped correcting anybody about it in year 2. She was 44, built like a fire door, and she had come up through 11 years on a municipal ladder company in a city on Earth where the buildings were old And the money was worse. She had taken the Anhal posting because it paid 4 times what home paid, and because her daughter was going to need 4 times what home paid. She kept a photograph in her locker of a 16-year-old girl with her arms folded and her mother's exact unimpressed expression, and she looked at it every shift, and she had never once mentioned it to the Kessari because the Kessari had not asked. The detail was Mari and Baptiste Akoro, who had been a structural engineer before he decided that buildings were more interesting when they were failing, and Hanna Sorensen, who could read a smoke layer the way other people read a face, and Willem Roth, who was 58 and ran the pumps and was the only man on the crew who had ever seen the inside of a real fire on Earth and did not talk about it, and Ori Adami, who was the funniest person on the station and knew it. And Danny Ruiz was 22 and had been on Anhal for 14 months. He had come out of the academy at 19, done 2 years on a probationary card, and taken the off-world posting because his mother had cried about it, and he had gone anyway, the way you do at 20. He was the youngest human on the station by 9 years. Mari had looked at his file, looked at him, and said one thing, which was, "You will do exactly what I tell you when I tell you, and I will hear about it later if you don't." He had been doing exactly that for 14 months, mostly. There was a conversation later that got repeated a lot. Mari had a habit of saying things at shift change that sounded like nothing and turned out to be load-bearing. About 4 months in, Danny had asked her, in the flat, exhausted way of a kid who has spent 9 hours pulling scorched structure out of a dead deck, what the point of any of it was. The fire was out. The people were gone. They were shoveling. Why did the Kessari even keep them? Mari had been coiling line. She did not look up. "Because someday they'll be wrong," she said. "About what?" "About the door," Mari said. "The doctrine says the door is a wall. It isn't. It's a door. It opens both ways. Someday somebody up there is going to close one and be wrong about it, and when that happens I want us standing next to it." Danny had laughed. Mari had not. There was one more thing about Mari Vega, and it mattered enormously later, and Danny did not know it at the time. 14 months earlier, in a kitchen on Earth, Danny's mother had cornered a woman she had never met and asked her, plainly, with no dignity at all, to bring her son home. And Mari Vega, who did not make promises, had made one. Princess Ilthara Kessar had been going down to the terraces for 2 years, and had gotten away with it for 2 years, which told you something about how little the court looked down. It had not started as rebellion. It had started as homework. She was the Queen's only living child, and she had been raised on briefings, and at 22 she had sat through a ministry presentation on terrace productivity that had included a slide with the words "unit hours of ambulatory labor" on it, and something in her had gone quietly and permanently wrong. She had asked a question. The question was whether the ambulatory labor had names. The minister had laughed because he thought it was a joke, and the whole room had laughed, and Ilthara had smiled and made a note and gone back to her rooms and sat for a long time. 2 weeks later, she had walked out of the Spire's upper galleries in a maintenance smock with her house marks covered and her throat light dimmed, and she had ridden a service lift down 7 kilometers, and she had spent 4 hours on Terrace 22 watching people make the air. She went back. She kept going back. She learned to keep her hands moving so nobody looked at them. She learned names. She learned that a fabrication tech named Osha Vell had worked 41 years on the same deck and had a bad hip and a granddaughter who wanted to be an astronomer. She learned that the terraces had their own jokes, and that most of them were about the court, and that most of them were extremely funny and completely accurate. She learned that the doctrine looked different from underneath. Up top, the ceiling doctrine was arithmetic. Down below, everybody knew exactly where the blast frames were, and everybody had done the walk, and everybody knew how long they had. The terraces did not resent it exactly. They had simply organized their entire emotional lives around a fact the court considered settled. There was a phrase down there, said dryly, said constantly, said the way humans say "be careful driving." mind your frames. She was not a fool. She knew what she was doing was a scandal in embryo. The blood of the house did not go under. There was protocol about it that predated the archaeology. She told herself it was study. She told herself she would stop. On the 11th day of Sevrek, Ilthara Kessar went down to the Ninth Terrace to watch a shift change, because Oshavel's granddaughter had gotten a placement at the observatory, and there was going to be something like a party. At 14:06 station time, a heat exchange manifold on the Ninth Terrace failed in a way the engineers had flagged 11 times in 3 years, and the Ministry of Containment had deferred 11 times in 3 years, because the fix was expensive, and the risk model said the frames would hold. The frames did hold, that was the thing. The doctrine worked perfectly. At 14:07 the deck filled with smoke moving at the speed of a running man. At 14:08 the Ninth Terrace containment alarm went out across the spire, and Captain Asavren of the Queen's Guard, standing watch on the Ninth Terrace primary frame, received the seal order from the Chamber of Containment and put her hand on the actuator, and did not move it, because there were people running toward her out of the smoke, and the doctrine gave her 40 seconds, and she used every one of them. At 14:08:41, with 219 Kessari still inside the volume, Asavren closed the door. And 9 decks down, in a locker on Terrace 16, 6 humans came off a bench like a single animal, because they had heard the alarm before. They had heard it 40 times, and it had never once meant anything they were allowed to do. Mari Vega already had her mask in her hand. BAP chase route now. 16-9, the maintenance chase, it's not rated. I didn't ask if it was rated. Willem Roth, who was 58 and had a pension in 11 months, said quietly, Mari, that's a sealed volume, that's a capital offense. Mari Vega looked at the door of the locker for exactly 1 second. Nobody stays in, she said. The maintenance chase between Terrace 16 and Terrace 9 was a 90-centimeter shaft designed for inspection drones, and had a ladder in it because some engineer 4 centuries ago had been sentimental. It had not been used by a body larger than a house cat in living memory. Baptiste Akoro went up it first because he was the one who could read the structure, and Hannah Sorensen went second, and Danny Ruiz went third, and Mari Vega went last, which was where she always went, because the last one up is the one who catches whatever falls. It took them 4 minutes to climb 7 decks. In fire time, 4 minutes is a geological era. Willem Roth stayed on 16 with the pump and the line and the entire remaining hope of the operation, and Ori Ademi stayed with him, and neither of them said anything about it, because somebody has to hold the bottom of the ladder, and everybody knows which one of you it is before it's ever said out loud. BAP punched the 9 access panel and the panel refused, because the volume was sealed and the panel was doing its job, and BAP took a pry bar to the hinge pins and did in 11 seconds what 4 centuries of Kessari engineering had considered impossible. The chase filled with smoke instantly, not gradually. The pressure differential grabbed the shaft and used it like a chimney, and the whole column went black in the time it takes to blink, and Danny, who had done 40 of these, who had done cold ones, who had never in his life been in a live one, felt the temperature come through his hood, and understood in his body something he had known in his head since he was 19. Mari's voice came through the mask link, absolutely level. Contact on me, left hand on the wall. We're going to the lift. The Ninth Terrace was a working deck 400 meters long, and it was full of people who were doing the only thing they knew how to do, which was die correctly. That was what Danny saw first, and it was the thing he never got over, and it was the thing that eventually changed a civilization. The Kessari were not panicking. There was no crush at the sealed frame. There was no screaming. 219 people had walked to the places the doctrine told them to walk, which were the low corners where the smoke layer was thinnest, and they had sat down in orderly rows, and they were waiting calmly, with their hands folded, for the 90 seconds. They had been raised on the arithmetic. They believed the arithmetic. The arithmetic said this was finished. Nobody had come in through that door in 400 years. Hannah Sorensen said on the link, in a voice Danny had never heard from her, "Mari, they're sitting down. I see them. Mari, they're just. I see them, Hannah." Mari Vega walked out of the smoke into the middle of a room full of people waiting to die, pulled her mask up off her face for exactly 2 seconds so that they could see there was a face inside it, and shouted, in the worst Kessari accent ever produced by a human throat, a phrase she had made Bap teach her 4 years ago and had never once had a reason to use. "Get up, follow the light, get up." Later in the accounts, this was the moment the terraces talked about. Not the fire, not the lift, not even the princess. It was the 2 seconds where a creature none of them had ever seen took the air off its own face in a room that was killing them, so that 219 people could see that something had come in. The old cargo lift at the far end of 9 had been decommissioned 11 years earlier because the freight volume no longer justified it, and it was still there because tearing things out of an arcology costs more than leaving them, and Bap had spent 2 years of boredom reading the Spire's structural archive for fun and knew it existed, and knew it had an independent power tap. It took them 19 minutes to move 211 people through a smoke layer to that lift. Danny did not remember most of it. He remembered pieces. He remembered a Kessari man twice his height, going completely rigid with the strangeness of being touched by an alien, and then simply putting his hand on Danny's shoulder and letting a child half his size lead him through a wall of black. He remembered Hannah on the deck with her light held up, doing nothing but standing in one place and being a light for 11 minutes, because a light that does not move is a direction, and a light that moves is a panic. He remembered Bap with his shoulder in a doorframe that wanted to close. He remembered counting. 211 out, 219 in. The math on a fire is not complicated, and everybody in the trade hates it. They found the last 8 under a collapsed conveyor gantry in the northwest quarter, which had come down across the low corner where the doctrine had told them to sit. 7 were pinned and conscious. The 8th was standing. The 8th was standing in a fire environment at minute 22, which was not possible, which was 14 times the number every Kessari child learns, and the reason she was standing was that she was standing with her back against a coolant riser that was still weeping, holding a soaked cargo tarp over the 7 pinned people with both arms above her head, and had been doing that, alone in the dark, for 20 minutes. Her name, though nobody in that room knew it, was Ilthara Kessar. Her throat light was the only light in that corner, and it was almost out. Her dorsal vents were seared. She could not speak. The air had taken her voice at minute 3. She had been holding the tarp so long her arms had gone past pain into a kind of structural fact. She was not, at that moment, a princess. She was a 23-year-old who had understood, faster than her entire government had managed in 4 centuries, one very small thing, that wet fabric is a barrier, and that the reason everyone died in 90 seconds was that nobody ever spent the 90 seconds on anything except accepting it. Mari Vega came around the gantry with her light and found her. The account that Ilthara gave later, the one she gave exactly once and then never again, was this. She said that she had been holding the tarp for what she thought was the rest of her life. She said that she had made peace with it in the way you do, and that the peace was not brave, it was just arithmetic because she had done the numbers too, and the numbers said the door was closed. And then she said the door was not closed. She said a light came around the gantry, and inside the light was a small shape, and the shape did not stop, and did not slow, and did not do the thing every Kessari does when it enters a finished place, which is calculate. She said it came straight at her, and it took the tarp out of her hands, and it said something in a language she did not know, and she understood it perfectly, because there are about 4 sentences in the universe that do not require translation, and one of them is "I've got it now." 19 minutes to move 211. 6 minutes to cut 7 people out from under a gantry with a hydraulic spreader that Willem Roth had sent up the chase on a rope, because he had gotten tired of waiting. Bap took 4 out. Hannah took 3. That left the gantry and the coolant riser and the tarp and 2 humans and 1 Kessari, and the deck above them, which had been on fire for 28 minutes, chose that moment to stop being a deck. It came down in the north quarter first. Danny felt it before he heard it. Mari was already moving. The route back to the lift closed. Not partly. Completely. 400 tons of fabrication deck folded into the corridor, and the corridor stopped existing. There was one way out of the northwest quarter after that, and it was a personnel hatch 11 meters up a ladder into the chase they had come in through, and the ladder was intact, and the hatch was intact, and the hatch was a 90-centimeter hole. Mari looked at the ladder. She looked at the Kessari, who was 7 feet tall. Danny said, "She won't fit." "She'll fit," Mari said. "She'll fit if she goes up folded and somebody's under her taking the weight the whole way, because she can't hold on. Look at her arms." Danny looked. Ilthara's arms were hanging at her sides like things that belonged to somebody else. 22 minutes of holding a tarp over 7 strangers had finished them. She could stand. She could not climb. She could not grip. She was functionally cargo. 11 meters, Danny said. 11 meters, Mari agreed. The gantry was still on top of the riser, and the riser was the only thing still putting water into that corner, and the gantry had shifted when the deck came down and was now resting on the riser in a way that was going to crush it in about 2 minutes, and when the riser went, the corner went, and the ladder was in the corner. 2 things had to happen. Somebody had to hold the gantry off the riser with the spreader. Somebody had to take 190 kilos of unconscious adjacent Kessari princess up 11 meters of ladder. There were 2 humans. Danny said, "I'll take the gantry." "No. Mari." "Ruiz." Mari Vega's voice did not rise. That was the part that stayed with him for the rest of his life. It did not rise even slightly. "You're 22 and you weigh 68 kilos and you can't hold that spreader. I can. Get her up the ladder." "Then you come after." "Then I come after." He knew standing there. He was 22 and he was not stupid, and he had been on the job for 3 years, and he knew exactly what was in that sentence. Mari put her hand on the back of his hood and pulled his head down against hers for half a second, which was as much as either of them was going to get. "Nobody stays in," she said. "That includes her. Go." 11 meters is 36 feet. Danny Ruiz went up 36 feet of vertical ladder in a 90-centimeter shaft, with a 7-foot alien folded across his back and shoulders and both of his hands on the rungs, which meant nothing was holding her on except the angle of his spine and the fact that he did not straighten it. He did it in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. He remembered 9 of the rungs. He did not remember the other 20-something. His mask seal broke at rung 11, and he breathed the chase for the rest of it and coughed blood for 3 weeks. Halfway up, Ilthara Kessar came back to herself enough to understand where she was and what was happening, and she did the thing she was most ashamed of afterward, and the thing that everyone who ever heard it forgave instantly. She tried to get off. She tried to push away. She could not make words, but she made the shape of them. She was 200 pounds heavier than the thing carrying her, and she understood, in the animal part of the brain that every species has, that she was going to kill it. And the small thing under her adjusted its grip, and kept climbing, and said, through a broken mask, in a language she did not know, the second sentence that does not require translation. "Not today." He got her through the hatch onto 16, and Aurea Damie got her under the arms, and Willem Roth got a mask on her, and Danny lay on the deck for 4 seconds. Then he went back down the ladder. The Board of Inquiry spent a lot of time on those 4 seconds because they wanted to establish that he had made a decision, and they could then establish that the decision was a violation. They were right that it was a decision. They never once got him to say it was a hard one. The gantry had crushed the riser. The corner was gone. Mari Vega was under the north end of the gantry with the spreader still in her hands, and she had held it for 6 minutes and 11 seconds after her mask went, which was 5 minutes and 40 seconds longer than she had needed to, because she had been counting a ladder. Danny found her by the light. She was not conscious. She was not going to be. He knew that the way you know the temperature. He got the spreader out of her hands, and he got her over his shoulder, and he went back up the ladder with her. 11 meters, again, on air he no longer had, with a woman who weighed 91 kilos. It took him 9 minutes. There is no version of this that is triumphant. He got her out. She had been dead for most of it. He knew she had been dead for most of it. He did it anyway, and if you ask anyone in the trade why, they will look at you like you have asked why water is wet, and the answer they will give you, in whatever language they speak, is some version of the same 4 words. Nobody stays in. At 15:41 station time, the Ninth Terrace event was recorded as contained. At 15:44, 211 Kessari workers were on Terrace 16, alive, sitting on a deck in the dark, being handed water by an off-duty fabrication crew that had no idea what had happened. At 15:46, 7 more came off a cargo lift. At 15:52, the door of a locker on Terrace 16 opened and a 22-year-old human walked out with 140 pounds of Kessari royalty leaning on his shoulder because she would not be carried the last part. She had made that absolutely clear with the only gesture her body still had, and on his other shoulder over it, carried the way you carry someone when there is no more dignity available and you are going to provide some anyway, was Mari Vega. Captain Asaf Wren of the Queen's Guard was standing at the head of the 16 concourse with 40 guards, because a seal had been broken and the Chamber of Containment had ordered arrests. She had closed the door at 14:08:41. She had used every one of her 40 seconds. She had been standing at that frame for 94 minutes since, and she had counted the people who did not come through it, and she was, by any reasonable measure, the most obedient officer in the Kessari service. She saw the princess. She saw the boy. She saw what was on his other shoulder, and she understood, all at once, in the middle of a corridor, in front of 40 of her own guards, exactly what had gone through that door in the direction nobody had ever thought was possible. Asaf Wren put her hand up and stopped her own arrest detail and stood there and let them pass. It cost her her commission 4 days later. She never once said it was a hard decision either. The official record of the Ninth Terrace event was 140 pages long, and it was, in the narrow sense, entirely accurate. It recorded a manifold failure. It recorded a seal at 14:08:41. It recorded 218 survivors and 1 fatality, which was a number without precedent in the history of Kessari containment, and should have been the most extraordinary line ever entered into a ministry ledger. The way the chamber handled it was a masterpiece. It did not lie. It never lied once. It simply reorganized the sentences. The 218 survivors were attributed to the performance of the cargo lift, described as an auxiliary evacuation asset, which was technically what it had become. The presence of the sublevel recovery detail inside the volume was recorded under the heading Seal Integrity Violation, 70 pages later, in a section about procedural failures. The 2 facts never appeared on the same page. A reader could go through the entire document and never once put together that the auxiliary evacuation asset had been operated by the procedural failure. The single fatality was recorded as follows: Vega M. Human Signatory Auxiliary, deceased within sealed volume. Cause: voluntary entry. Voluntary entry. That was the cause of death. And Princess Ilthara Kessar was not in the document at all. That decision was made in the 4th hour, in a room with 6 people in it, and it was made by her mother. It was, in a certain light, an act of love. Vishith Kessar had been handed, at the worst moment of her life, a piece of information that would have destroyed her daughter's future. That the heir to the Kessari throne had spent 2 years going down into the terraces in disguise, in violation of protocol that was older than the archaeology, and had been caught in a fire doing it. The court would not have forgiven that. It would not have forgiven the disguise, the deception, the presence, or the rescue. Every one of those was a scandal, and stacked together they were an abdication. So the queen looked at her daughter, who was lying on a medical table with her vents seared and her arms in braces and her throat like guttering, and who could not speak, and who was 23, and she made the decision that a mother makes and a sovereign should not. She had her daughter moved to the observatory before dawn. She had the observatory's log adjusted, not falsified, adjusted to show a routine visit. She had 11 people spoken to. She did not have to threaten any of them. She was the queen, and in the Hall of the 9 Silences you do not need volume. And when Ilthara got her voice back, 11 days later, and used the first sentence of it to say, "Mother, there was a woman," Vishith Kessar put her hand on her daughter's chest and said the thing that broke everything. "There was no woman, Ilthara. You were never there." Lord Rusk Kasevrin, Minister of Containment, had known where the princess was at 14:07 on the 11th of Sevrek. He had known because his ministry ran the Terrace sensor grid, and because he had been quietly running a passive trace on the princess's biometric signature for 11 months, which was not illegal exactly, and which he had begun for the reason ambitious men begin things, which is that information is a coin, and you never know when a market opens. At 14:07 he had seen her signature on the Ninth Terrace. At 14:08 the seal order went from his chamber to Asavren's hand. Between those two facts were 11 minutes in which Lord Rusk Kasevrin said nothing to anybody, and then, at 14:19, reported to the Queen's office that the 9th was sealed, and the count was 219. He did not order her death. That is important. He did not do anything. He simply declined for 11 minutes to open his mouth, and if the humans had not existed, the Kessari succession would have passed from Vishith to her nephew, who was Rusk's son-in-law, and no one would ever have known that a man had done nothing on purpose. This is what Rusk understood better than anyone in the Spire. The sealing doctrine was not primarily a safety policy. It was a machine for converting murder into arithmetic. And a man who runs that machine, and who is patient, and who never touches the actuator himself, can do almost anything. The humans had ruined it, not by breaking the seal, by surviving it. Because now there was a boy alive on the station who had been in that volume and had seen the princess in it. And there were 218 Kessari who had walked out of a finished place. And every one of them was, in the most dangerous sense available, a witness to the fact that the arithmetic had a variable in it that nobody had put there. So Rusk did the only thing available to a competent man in a bad position. He made it a legal question. Seal integrity was a capital matter. It always had been. The doctrine could not survive if any individual with a pry bar could decide the numbers were wrong. That was not villainy. That was the actual, honest, load-bearing argument, and Rusk made it beautifully, for 11 weeks, in 7 separate hearings, and he was not even wrong. The detail was dissolved. Akoro, Sorensen, Roth, and Adami were removed from the roll and given transit. Roth lost his pension over it and said on the record that he would do it again, and then said a second sentence that had to be struck. And Daniel Ruiz, who had gone in twice, was remanded to the chamber for disposition, because they needed one, and he was the youngest and the least protected, and the one who had been photographed carrying a body. Consul Hale, who was a decent man in an impossible job, sat Danny down in week 9 and told him the truth, which was that the human signatory had 19 years of standing and no leverage, and that if Danny said the word princess in open court, he would be calling the queen a liar in her own house, and there would be no version of that where he went home. "They'll take the expulsion," Hale said. "They want the expulsion. Stand there, say nothing, take the writ, and I will put you on a ship." Danny said, "What about Mari?" Hale looked at his hands. Mari Vega's body was in a containment locker on Terrace 2. It had been classified at intake as material recovered from a sealed volume, because that is what the intake code says, because the intake code was written for debris. Under Kessari law, material recovered from a sealed volume is the property of the Chamber of Containment and may not be released until the event file is closed. The event file could not be closed while a disposition was pending. The disposition was Danny. So Mari Vega had been in a locker for 11 weeks, 3 meters from a hallway, and could not be sent home to a 16-year-old girl on Earth until the Kessari finished deciding whether to execute the boy who had carried her out. "I'm working on it," Hale said. "How long?" "Danny." "How long?" Hale said, "There's a category for biological material with no claimant. After 120 days, it's reduced and vented." Danny sat in that chair for a while. Then he said, "Her kid's name is Alina. She's 16. She's got a picture of her mom on a ladder truck, and she's got the mom's face exactly. And I have to go stand in her doorway and tell her I left her in a drawer." Hale had no answer. There wasn't one. Ilthara Kessar spent 11 weeks becoming a different person, and she did it almost entirely in silence, in a room at the top of the world with her arms in braces. The first 3 weeks she obeyed. That is not a shameful thing to admit, and she never pretended otherwise. She was 23 and her mother had told her she was never there, and her mother was the queen, and there is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from having your own memory overruled by someone who loves you. She would lie in the observatory and look at the ceiling and run it, the gantry, the tarp, her arms. The light coming around the corner and not slowing down. She would run it 100 times a day, and every time she got to the part where the light did not slow down, something in her chest did a thing she had no word for, because the Kessari did not have that word either. In week 4, they gave her the survivor list. She read 218 names. She knew 9 of them. O'Chevelle, 41 years on the deck, bad hip. O'Chevelle was on the list. O'Chevelle's granddaughter had started at the observatory the following week, and there was a note about it in the Terrace bulletin, and Ilthara read the note 11 times. 218 names, and 1 name at the bottom under a different heading, spelled wrong. Vega M. That was when she stopped obeying, though it took another 6 weeks for anyone to notice. She started with the archive, because she was a princess, and the archive was the one place she could go without a reason. The Kessari Grand Archive occupied 11 floors and was administered, in its lowest and least visited section, by an archivist named Senik Oth, who was 240 years old, blind since his 90th year, and in possession of the single most inconvenient memory in the ascendancy. Ilthara came to him in week 6 with a question she had constructed very carefully, because she had learned by then to be careful. She asked him whether there had ever been a Kessari word for what the humans did. Senik Oth was quiet for a long time. Then he asked her to describe it, and she did, and she got about 4 sentences in before her voice went, and she stopped, and she stood in an archive with her arms in braces and could not finish a sentence in front of a blind man. And Senik Oth said, "Ah, Threna." She said she did not know the word. "No," he said, "you wouldn't. It was struck from the ceremonial codex in the 3rd year of the doctrine, 411 years ago, along with 940 other entries." He took her slowly, on a bad hip of his own, to a shelf. Before the sealing doctrine, the Kessari had fought fires, badly, hopelessly, with a mortality rate that eventually became the argument for the doctrine. For 11,000 years, there had been an order of Kessari called the Thren, which meant carriers, who went into finished places to bring people out, and who died at a rate that modern Kessari found literally unbelievable when they saw the figures. And there had been a rite. The rite was called Kelthrena, which Seneca translated after a while as the returning, or more precisely as the taking back of weight. The logic of it was this: if a carrier took your weight out of a finished place, the debt created was not a debt of gratitude, because gratitude is a feeling and feelings are not law. It was a debt of weight, literal, physical. Something had been carried, and it could not be uncarried, and the only discharge was to take that weight back in front of the sovereign, publicly, with your own body, so that everybody present had to watch you do it. Ilthara said, "Take it back how?" "You lift them," Seneca said. "You take their whole weight onto yourself, in the sovereign's sight, and you say their name. And then they are Threnkin, blood of your house. It is not a metaphor, princess. It is not a courtesy. It is the oldest instrument in our law, and it predates the throne. Every charge, every debt, every sentence standing against the named passes into the house that names them. It cannot be tried in a chamber. It has to be tried by the head of the house." Ilthara stood very still. "And there is the second half," Seneca said. "What second half?" "The rite is symmetrical, or it is nothing. If you take their weight back, you take up what they were carrying, whatever it was, whatever it cost. You carry it once yourself in the sight of the same court." He turned his blind face toward her. "That is why they struck it, you understand. Not because it was old. The doctrine could live with old. It could not live with a law that said the people who closed doors must one day carry what was behind them." Ilthara Kessar went back to her rooms and did not sleep, and at some point in that night she stopped being the queen's daughter and started being something the Kessari had not had for 411 years. She saw Danny Ruiz exactly once before the hall. It was week 10. She engineered it badly and obviously, using a medical review as cover, and it lasted 9 minutes in a corridor outside a chamber annex with 2 guards pretending to be furniture. He looked terrible. He was still coughing. He had lost weight he did not have. He came to attention when he saw her because someone had drilled him, and she hated it immediately. She said, "Do not do that." He stopped doing it. They stood there. She was 7 feet tall, and he came up to the middle of her chest, and they had last seen each other in the dark, and neither of them had ever heard the other's voice at a normal volume. She said, "I am told I was never there." Danny said, "Yeah. I got that too. Do you know what they will do to you?" "I've got a general idea." "You could say it," she said. "In the hall, you could say my name. It would not save you, but it would ruin them, and I would confirm it, and my mother could not." "No," Danny said. She stopped. "You'd lose everything," he said. "You'd lose the throne, the house, the whole thing. 2 years going down there in a smock. They'd call it all a lie. Every terrace you ever walked on, they'd say you were slumming, and they'd be wrong, and it wouldn't matter." "That is my decision." "It is," he agreed, "but you asked if I'd make it for you." "And I won't." Ilthara Kessar looked down at a 22-year-old human in a corridor, and understood, with total clarity, that she was standing in front of the second person in her life who had refused to let her pay for something. She said her name was Vega. "Marisol," Danny said, and his voice did the thing voices do. "Mari, she had a kid, Alina, she's 16. He stopped. He got it back. She's in a locker on 2, and they're going to vent her in 29 days because I'm still alive, and that's the joke, Your Highness. That's the actual joke. If they just killed me in week 1, she'd be home already." Ilthara said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "What did she say to you, at the ladder?" And Danny Ruiz told her. Ilthara went back up 7 kilometers to the top of the world, and stood at a window, and looked out over an arcology that held 9 million people behind 400 years of doors. Nobody stays in. She thought about the second half of the rite. She thought about what Mari Vega had been carrying, and what it would mean to take it up, and where it would have to be carried from, and through what room and past whom, and she found that she was not afraid, which surprised her, and then she found out why she was not afraid, which did not. She was not afraid because somebody had already gone up 11 meters of ladder for her when the math said no. 11 days later, the Hall of the 9 Silences convened to expel the human detail from the Spire of Anhal, and Princess Ilthara Kessar took her place on the 8th step, one below her mother, with her hands empty and her throat light banked low, and waited for Lord Roos Ka-Severin to finish reading. "Remanded to the chamber for disposition," Lord Roos Ka-Severin said, and lowered the writ, and the Hall of the 9 Silences did what it had been built to do, which was nothing. Danny Ruiz stood on the mark and looked at the floor, and thought about a locker on Terrace 2. He had decided, somewhere around week 10, that he was not going to say anything, not because Consul Hale had told him to. Because of the second thing, the thing he had not said to the princess in the corridor, which was that if he named her and she confirmed it, the record would open, and if the record opened, the event file would stay open, and if the event file stayed open, Mari stayed in the drawer. The only way to get her home was to let them close the file, and the only way to let them close the file was to be the disposition. He had done the arithmetic. He had done it 11 times. It came out the same way every time, and he had made his peace with it about as well as a 22-year-old can, which is to say not at all, but functionally. That was the state of things at the moment the princess came down the stair. He heard her before he saw her, 9 steps unhurried. He thought distantly that she was going to try to stop it, and he thought, with real fear, that he was going to have to look at the Queen of the Kessari and contradict her daughter in front of 400 people, and he set himself to do it. Then Ilthara Kessar crossed the 6 paces to him, and she did not speak at all. She went down on one knee. That alone was enough. That alone, in that room on that floor, would have been in the histories. The blood of the house did not kneel. There was no protocol for it because no protocol had ever been necessary. 406 Kessari drew in a breath at the same moment, and the walls swallowed it. But she was not kneeling to him. She was getting under him. She put her right arm behind his knees and her left arm across his back, and she stood up, and she took Daniel Ruiz's entire weight off the floor of the Hall of the 9 Silences and held him against her chest like something recovered. And the room came apart. The walls failed. 4 centuries of acoustic engineering, 4 centuries of tuned stone designed to make outrage physically impossible, met 406 nobles going vertical at once, and the sound went up into the glass vault and hung there and rang, and it was, by every account that survives, the loudest thing that had ever happened inside the Kessari government. Because of what they thought they saw. This has to be said plainly, because it is the entire hinge of the thing. The Kessari court did not see a right. They could not. The right had been struck 411 years earlier, and struck thoroughly, and not one person in that hall except a blind archivist 11 floors down had ever heard the word Threna in their lives. They saw the heir to the ascendancy pick up an alien. Touch among the Kessari is not casual. It is not affectionate. It is not incidental. Kessari physiology carries every heat gradient on the skin, and the blood of the house is not touched at all ever by anyone without an instrument of state to authorize it. There are exactly 3 occasions in Kessari law where a royal body makes contact with another body, and all 3 of them are marriages. So the court saw a scandal, and the court, being a court, immediately saw 11 scandals. Half the hall read it as a claim. A mating declaration, made in the open in the sovereign's sight, in the most deliberate and unmistakable form available, and made toward a creature that stood 5 feet 9, and had no house, no line, no name, and was at that moment under a writ of disposition. The Lady Asuvan of the Fourth Terrace Assembly said afterward that her first coherent thought was that the girl had gone mad from the smoke, which was closer than she knew. The other half read it as degradation, which was worse. Not that the princess had claimed the human, that the human had somehow claimed the princess. There were 11 weeks of rumor about the girl's seclusion, the arms, the silence, the observatory, and every one of those rumors reassembled itself in the space of 2 seconds into a story about an alien and an unwell young woman, and there were voices in that hall calling for Danny's death before the princess had finished standing up. And Danny Ruiz, who was being held 6 inches off the floor by a 7-foot alien in front of 400 screaming aristocrats, understood none of it, and did the only thing he could think of, which was to hold absolutely still, because when somebody is carrying you, the worst thing you can do is move. Lord Roos Kessari dropped the writ. It was the only genuinely unguarded thing he did in 11 weeks. It landed on the stone, and it made a sound and nobody heard it. Queen Vishith Kessari Anhal sat on the 9th step and did not move at all. Ilthara Kessar stood in the middle of it and waited. That was the part that nobody was ready for. She did not shout over them. She did not explain. She simply stood there, holding him, and let 406 people scream themselves down, which took 2 minutes and 11 seconds, because there is no sustaining outrage at a person who is not participating in it. When the hall had gone quiet enough for the walls to start working again, the princess spoke, and she pitched her voice for the room, which she had been taught to do since she was 6, and which she had never once used for anything that mattered until now. "Kelthrena," she said, "I invoke the returning. Senek Oth, archivist of the 9th Recension, stands in the gallery and will attest the form." Silence. Not the engineered kind, the other kind. 406 people looked at each other, and the appalling thing, the thing that Ilthara had counted on, was that not one of them knew the word, and every single one of them knew that they should. "On the 11th day of Sevrek," Ilthara said, "I was on the 9th Terrace. Somewhere in the hall, a chair went over. I was there because I have been going down for 2 years, in a smock with my marks covered, because I am to rule 9 million people, and I had been given a slide that called them ambulatory labor, and I wanted to know if that was true." Her throat light was coming up. It came up like something being turned on in a house that had been dark a long time. "It is not true. Their names are Oshavel and Rithik Om and Seva Kadun and 215 more, and I can say all of them, and I will if this hall requires it." Rusk had recovered. He was very good. He said into the gap in the reasonable voice, "Your Highness is unwell." "At 1408, Ilthara said, "the Chamber of Containment sealed the volume with me inside it. That was correct. I want the record to show that I say it was correct. Captain Asavren held that door for 40 seconds and used every one of them, and she is not at fault, and I will hear no one say she is." She had not put Danny down. She had been holding a human off the floor for 4 minutes now, and her arms, which had held a wet tarp over 7 strangers for 22 minutes 11 weeks ago, had begun to shake. Nobody in the hall failed to see it. It was the single most important detail in the room, and every one of them was watching it, and not one of them understood yet that the shaking was the point, that the right required the weight to be taken by the body and not by servants and not by protocol, and that a right which requires a princess to shake in public is precisely the kind of right a Ministry of Containment gets struck from the Codex. "At 1430, she said, "I was under a collapsed gantry on the northwest quarter with 7 people who could not move, holding a soaked tarp, and I had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said I was finished. I am the daughter of this house, and I sat in a finished place and accepted the numbers, because that is what we teach. That is what we have taught for 400 years. We teach our people to sit down." She looked for the first time at the 9th step. "Mother," she said. 219 of us sat down in orderly rows and folded our hands. And then a door that had never opened, and something came in that did not stop to calculate. She turned back to the hall and lifted the human slightly, resettling him, because her arms were failing and she was not going to let go. His name is Daniel Ruiz. He is 22 years old. He carried me 11 meters up a vertical ladder in a 90-centimeter shaft with both his hands on the rungs, which means the only thing holding me on was the shape of his back. His mask broke at rung 11. He has been coughing blood for 11 weeks, and this chamber has classified that as evidence of trespass. She let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. I weigh 191 kilos. He weighs 68. Halfway up, I understood what I was doing to him, and I tried to get off, and he would not let me. And I have spent 11 weeks in a room at the top of the world being told that this did not happen. Ilthara Kessar's arms were shaking so badly now that the tremor had gotten into her voice, and she used it. "Kelthrena," she said, "I have taken back the weight in the sovereign's sight. I named Daniel Ruiz Threnkin, blood of the house of Kessar, and every charge and every debt and every sentence standing against him passes out of the chamber of containment and into my mother's hands, where it can be looked at in the daylight by someone who has to answer for it." And then she put him down, carefully, on his feet, and stepped back, and stood there with her ruined arms hanging at her sides, and the Hall of the Nine Silences held 406 people who had just watched their own law come back from the dead. Senek Oth's voice came from the gallery, thin and dry and 240 years old, and the walls for once let it through. "The form is correct," the archivist said. "Codex entry 941, struck in the 3rd year of the doctrine by ministerial motion and never repealed. Struck is not repealed. It is still law. It has been law the entire time." Danny Ruiz stood on the mark in front of the Queen of the Kessari, and had, at that moment, exactly one thought, and the thought was that his crew chief had told him someday somebody up there was going to close a door and be wrong about it, and that he wished, with an intensity that nearly took his legs, that Mari Vega could have been in that room to see the door open the other way. Lord Roos Kasevrin picked up his writ. He was, whatever else he was, a professional. He had lost the room. He had lost the law. He had lost 11 weeks of work in 4 minutes, and he did not flinch, because he was already 3 moves ahead, and he had seen the one thing nobody else in that hall had noticed. The right required a rescue. If there was no rescue, there was no wait. If there was no wait, there was no returning. The entire instrument, 400 years buried and 11 minutes resurrected, rested on a single load-bearing fact, and that fact was not in the record. "Your Highness," Rusk said, and his voice was gentle, and that was how you knew. "I do not dispute the form. I would not presume. The archivist is authoritative, and I withdraw nothing but my ignorance." He turned to the 9th step. "I dispute the predicate." Ilthara went very still. "Kelthrena requires a carrying," Rusk said to the room reasonably, the way he had said everything for 30 years. "It requires that the one who names was carried out of a sealed volume. This chamber has a record of the Ninth Terrace event. It is 140 pages. It was compiled under my hand and certified under the hand of the Crown, and it says, 'I invite anyone to read it that Her Highness was in the observatory at 1408 on the 11th of Sevrek.' It is signed. It is sealed. It was signed by the Queen." He let it land. "The princess was never on the Ninth Terrace," Lord Roos Kasevrin said. "The Crown has already said so. There was no carrying, there is no weight, there is no right. What there is a young woman who has been unwell for 11 weeks, and a human who has been standing very close to her for 11 weeks, and a chamber that has been extraordinarily patient." And then he did the thing that made him what he was. He did not press it himself. He turned and he bowed, and he offered it with both hands to the 9th step. "Majesty," Rusk said, "the record is yours. It requires only your confirmation. One word and the chamber will handle the rest, and no one will ever have to speak of any of this again. The hall of the 9 silences turned, all of it, 406 faces and one blind archivist and one human and one princess with ruined arms, and looked at Queen Vishith Kessari. She sat on the 9th step of a stair with 9 steps. To her left, her daughter, who had just torn her own life open in public. To her right, a man holding out a pen. And the arithmetic in front of her was the cleanest she had ever seen in 41 years of governing. Confirmed the record, a record she had made out of love in the 4th hour, to protect a 23-year-old, and her daughter's 2 years in the terraces became the delusion of a sick girl. And the succession held, and the doctrine held, and the boy took the writ, and the file closed, and Marisol Vega went home to earth to her daughter in a box. Deny the record, and the throne had lied, publicly in the hall. And every one of those 140 pages came open, and with them 400 years of pages, all of them, every sealed volume, every folded hand, every set of numbers her house had signed since the 3rd year of the doctrine. One word. Queen Vishith Kessari looked at her daughter's arms, and she reached out and took the pen. Ilthara Kessari watched her mother take the pen, and she did not beg. That surprised people afterward, the ones who told it wrong. They expected her to plead. But Ilthara had spent 11 weeks in a room learning a thing about her own family that she could not unlearn, which was that her mother was not going to be moved by love, because love was exactly what had signed the record in the first place. Love had put her in the observatory. Love had made her a liar. There was nothing left to appeal to that had not already been used against her. So she did not plead. She invoked the second half. Kalthrena is symmetrical, she said, or it is nothing. Her mother's hand stopped. The archivist will attest, Ilthara said. The one who takes back the weight takes up what the carrier was carrying, once, in their own body in the sight of the same court. She turned to the gallery. Senek Oth, is that the form? That is the form, said the old blind voice. It is not optional. A returning that does not complete is a returning that did not occur. Then I have not finished, Ilthara said, and this hall may not adjourn and the crown may not sign because the right is open. Rusk said very quietly, there is nothing to carry. There is. Your Highness, the human carried you. You have taken that back. It is done, and it is theater and the chamber. He carried me, Ilthara said, and then he put me down on terrace 16, and then he went back down the ladder. The hall did not know that part. It was in the record, on page 91, under seal integrity violation, second entry, and nobody had ever read page 91 next to page 11. He went back into a finished place, Ilthara said. On air he no longer had, for a woman he already knew was dead, and he brought her up 11 meters, and it took him 9 minutes, and that is the weight Daniel Ruiz was carrying when he came out of that door. She was already walking. Not toward the stair, toward the great doors at the far end, 900 feet of black stone away, and the hall of the 9 silences watched the heir to the Kessari ascendancy walk out of her own court in the middle of a rite with her arms hanging useless at her sides, and nobody stopped her, because nobody in 400 years had written a procedure for this. Marisol Vega had been in a containment locker on Terrace 2 for 81 days. The locker was 3 meters from a service hallway, in a bank of 11 identical drawers, and the label on the front said, in the chamber's clean type, material recovered from sealed volume, event SCVREK, 11, disposition pending. 2 chamber officers were on the door. They had been on that door in rotation for 81 days, and they had never once opened it, because the intake code did not require them to look at what it was categorizing. The princess came down 7 kilometers and told them to open it. They asked for an instrument of state. She had none. She had no writ, No order, no seal, no ministerial countersign, and both of her arms were shaking so badly she could not have signed one if she had. So she stood in a service hallway on Terrace 2, and did the only thing she had left, which was to tell them who was in the drawer. She told them her name was Marisol. She told them she was 44 and she had run a crew for 6 years, and she had come out here because her daughter was going to need money. She told them the girl's name was Alina and she was 16 and had her mother's exact face. She told them that this woman had come around a gantry into a room where 219 Kessari were sitting down to die, and had taken the air off her own face so that they could see there was a face inside it, and had shouted at them in terrible Kessari to get up. She told them HFY was alive. She told them HFY's granddaughter had started at the observatory. She told them that this woman had held a gantry off a coolant riser for 6 minutes and 11 seconds longer than she needed to, because she was counting a ladder. She told them all of it in a service hallway, to 2 officers whose names she did not know, with no authority of any kind, and it took 9 minutes. And one of them, a junior officer named Vescaroon, who was 31 years old and had spent 11 weeks standing next to a drawer, said, "Highness, she's very heavy," and opened it. There is a thing that happens sometimes in the histories of civilizations, where you can point at a single hallway and a single hour. The Hall of the 9 Silences waited 19 minutes. Nobody left. 406 people who had spent their entire lives leaving rooms at precisely the correct moment stood in that one and did not move. The Queen sat on the 9th step with a pen in her hand. Rusk stood beside her, and for the first time in 30 years, Lord Rusk Kessari could not think of the next move, because there wasn't one, because the next move was not political. Danny Ruiz stood on the mark. Consul Hale had come down the aisle and was standing beside him, in violation of every protocol in the building, and had put a hand on his shoulder, and neither of them said anything. At the 19th minute, the great doors opened. Princess Ilthara Kessar came into the Hall of the 9 Silences alone, carrying a dead human woman on her back. She had refused the officers. That got out later. Vescaroon told it for the rest of his life. He had offered, and she had told him that the right required the weight to be taken by the body, and that if anyone helped her it did not count, and that 400 years of her family's law had been built on other people carrying things for them, and she was not going to do that today. 91 kilos, 900 feet. Her arms were finished. They had been finished 11 weeks ago under a gantry, and finished again 4 minutes into holding a human off the floor, and now they were something past finished, and she had solved it the way you solve it, which is with your back and your legs and your spine and your refusal. She had Mari Vega across her shoulders in a carry that no Kessari had performed in 411 years, and that every human firefighter learns in the first month, because Senek Oth had shown her a plate in a codex from before the doctrine, and she had practiced it, alone, in a room at the top of the world on a rolled mattress, for 11 nights. She walked the aisle. It took her 4 minutes. She had to stop twice. Both times the hall watched a 23-year-old stand absolutely still under a weight she could not put down, because putting it down was the one thing the right would not permit, and then start walking again. There was no sound. The walls did not have to swallow anything. There was simply no sound, in a room with 406 people in it, for 4 minutes, except the boots of a princess and the boots of a dead woman hanging down her back, knocking softly against her thigh. Danny Ruiz turned at the sound of the doors and saw her coming, and his knees went, and Consul Hale caught him, and he stayed standing because Hale kept him standing, and he did not look away because she had not looked away either. At the base of the stair, Ilthara Kessar stopped. She could not kneel. She physically could not. Her body would not do it and the weight would have gone. So she stood at the foot of the 9 steps with Marisol Vega across her shoulders and looked up at her mother and said the only thing she had left, and it was not her line. It was borrowed. It had come to her in a corridor in week 10 from a 22-year-old with blood in his cough, and she had carried it 7 kilometers up and 900 feet across, and she handed it to the Kessari ascendancy, the way you hand someone a live thing. "Mother," said Princess Ilthara Kessar, "nobody stays in." Queen Vishith Kessar Anhal had been sovereign for 41 years. She had signed 11,000 containment findings. She had done the arithmetic on all of them, and she had never once been wrong, in the narrow sense, in the sense the numbers cared about. She had built a reign and an entire moral architecture on the proposition that the door is a wall, and she had believed it, because for 400 years there had been nothing on the other side of that door except fire and folded hands. And she looked down 9 steps at her only child, shaking under a corpse, and understood that she was not being asked to change a policy. She was being asked to look. That was all the right had ever been. That was why they struck it, not because it was old. Because Kelthrena at bottom was a law that said, if you close a door, you will one day carry what was behind it in your own arms in front of everyone, and you will not be permitted to look away, or to have a servant do it, or to convert it into a number. 411 years of Kessari government had been, in the final analysis, an extremely sophisticated apparatus for not carrying anything. The queen of the Kessari put down the pen. She stood. She came down the stair. She did not hurry. She came down all 9 steps, and the court did not breathe, and Rusk said, "Majesty," once, and she went past him as if he were a chair. At the bottom, she stopped in front of her daughter. "Ilthara," she said, "let me help you." "You may not," Ilthara said. Her voice was gone. It was almost nothing. "The right says the weight is mine. If you take it, it doesn't count." And Queen Vishith Kessar Anhal, sovereign of 9 million, said the sentence that ended the sealing doctrine. "Then I will invoke my own." She turned to the gallery. "Archivist, if the one who closed the door takes up the weight of the one behind it, is there a form?" There was a long silence. Then Senek Oth, 240 years old, blind since his 90th year, said, in a voice that cracked all the way through, "Majesty, there is. It has been waiting 411 years. Entry 940. It sits directly above your daughters." "Then attest it," said the queen, and she stepped in beside Ilthara and put her hands under Marisol Vega and took half the weight. They carried her up the 9 steps together. It took a long time. The queen was 68 and had not lifted anything heavier than a seal ring in 4 decades, and twice she had to stop, and her daughter stopped with her, and the hall of the 9 silences stood and watched its sovereign, and its heir carry a dead alien firefighter up the stair of the Kessari throne, 1 step at a time, with nobody helping. At the top they laid her down on the 9th step, in the place where the blood of the house sits, and the queen straightened and turned around, and her throat light was blazing, and she said, to 406 people, and to a record that could never be closed again. Her name was Marisol Vega. She was 44 years old. She has a daughter named Alina who is 16 and has been waiting 81 days. She came into a finished place, and she took the air off her own face so that my people could see her, and she told them to get up. 218 of them got up. Vishith Kessar looked out at her court. She has been in a drawer on Terrace 2, 3 meters from a hallway, labeled as material, since the 11th of Sevrek, because I signed a page that said my daughter was in the observatory. She stopped. She was the queen. She took the time she needed. I signed it in the 4th hour because I was frightened, and because Ilthara was 23 and I did not want the court to eat her. It was a lie. I am saying it here in the hall in front of the record so that no one has to find it later. The crown lied about the 11th of Sevrek. Every page that follows from it is void. The event file is closed as of this moment, and Marisol Vega goes home tonight. The hall came apart for the second time in 1 hour, and this time the walls did not even try. There was more, of course. There always is. Government is not a moment, it is the 11 months after a moment. The record was reopened by the Queen's order and handed to a commission that did not report to the Chamber of Containment, and on the 4th day, a junior analyst pulled the ministerial trace logs, because that is what junior analysts do, and found a passive monitor on the princess's signature that had been running for 11 months. It had registered on the Ninth Terrace at 14:07. The chamber had reported the seal to the Queen's office at 14:19. 11 minutes. Rusk never denied it. That was the strange thing, and the thing that made the business genuinely tragic rather than merely satisfying. When they brought him the logs, he looked at them a while and said, "I did nothing," and he meant it as a defense, and he was still saying it as a defense at his hearing, and he never once understood why the room went quiet every time. He had spent 30 years inside a machine that turned inaction into arithmetic, and he had believed the machine so completely that he could not locate the crime, because, in the entire moral vocabulary of the sealing doctrine, there was no word for a man who watches a door close on a girl he could have saved by speaking. They had to build one. It is in the Codex now, entry 942, and it was written by a princess. Rusk was stripped and sent to work a deck on Terrace 22, at Ilthara's insistence and over nearly everyone's objection, because she said the problem with Rusk was that he had never met anyone he had signed away. HFY trained him. He is quiet and adequate at the work, and once in the 4th year he pulled a man out of a coolant scald and did not report it, and someone reported it for him. Captain Asa Vren got her commission back. She did not want it. She was given something else instead. The sealing doctrine was not abolished, and anyone who tells it that way has never run anything. You cannot abolish physics. A Kessari still has 90 seconds. The frame's still close. What changed was that the Kessari built the thing they had spent 4 centuries proving was impossible, which was a reason to have 90 seconds at all. They called it the open door, officially the Thren core, and everyone calls it the Thren, which is a word that was struck from the Codex 411 years ago and is now painted on the side of 900 vehicles. Asa Vren commanded it for its first 6 years. It has Kessari in it and humans in it, and the humans are not janitors, they are instructors, because it turns out that when your species has 90 seconds and another species has 40 minutes, the correct move is not to stop going in. It is to send the ones with 40 minutes first and follow them, and get very good at the 90 seconds you have. Kessari fire mortality has fallen by 91% in 11 years. That number is the first slide in every briefing now. Under it, in small type, because Ilthara Kessar insisted and would not compromise, is a second line. This figure represents 411 years of people who sat down. Danny Ruiz went home. He went 11 days after the hall, on a ship, in a hold with a box, because there was no version of it where anyone else did that. He stood in a doorway in a city on Earth where the buildings are old and the money is worse, and a 16-year-old girl with her mother's exact unimpressed face opened the door, and he said the sentence he had been building for 81 days, and it fell apart about 4 words in, the way they do. He gave her the helmet. He gave her the photograph out of the locker, the one of herself with her arms folded, that her mother had looked at every shift for 6 years and never mentioned to anybody. He told her about the tarp and the gantry and the 2 seconds where Mari Vega took the air off her own face, and he told her what her mother's last sentence was, and Elena Vega listened to all of it standing up in a doorway, and then she said, "Was it fast?" And Danny said, "No." And she said, "Okay," and let him in. The princess was on the landing. She had come. Of course she had come. She had been carrying the second half of a promise for 81 days, and there was exactly one place to put it down. She had come without an entourage, in a coat, 7 feet tall on a fire escape landing in an old human city, and she had waited outside for 2 hours because she said it was not her doorway. Elena Vega looked up at the alien in her stairwell for a long moment. Ilthara Kessar knelt down on a landing so that a 16-year-old would not have to look up at her, which cost her something, and said, "Your mother came into a room where I was sitting down to die, and she told me to get up." And then the Queen's daughter said the rest of it, all 218 names, because Elena asked her to, and it took 40 minutes, and they sat on the stairs while she did it. Danny went back. Everyone assumed he wouldn't, and the ones who assumed it did not know him. He went back because Mari had told him that someday somebody up there would close a door and be wrong about it, and she wanted the crew standing next to it, and because now there were 900 vehicles with her word on the side, and somebody had to teach 7-foot people how to move a body through a 90-centimeter shaft. He is 33 now. He runs the human instruction wing of the Thren Corps. He has never once used the word Threnkin about himself, and the Kessari court uses it about him constantly, and it has stopped being a scandal so completely that the young ones do not understand why anyone ever screamed. Ilthara Kessar is the queen now. She was crowned in the Hall of the 9 Silences, on a stair with 9 steps, and the acoustic tuning has never been repaired on her explicit order so that the room can hear itself. She goes down, not in a smock anymore. There is no point, everyone knows her face. She has a certification and a rated mask and 1100 hours, and the Corps hates it and the court hates it, and she has told them all the same thing in the same tone, that she is the head of a house that spent 4 centuries not carrying anything, that the debt on that is not discharged and will not be discharged in her lifetime, and that she intends to work it off 90 seconds at a time. On the 9th step of the throne of the Kessari ascendancy, where the blood of the house sits, there is a helmet. It is human. It is scorched down one side. It has a name stenciled on the back in letters that have gone brown, and every visiting delegation asks about it, and the Queen tells them, every time, all of it from the manifold to the ladder, and she never shortens it. And when they ask her why she did it in the open, in front of 400 people, in the one room on the planet built to make certain that nobody ever had to see anything, Queen Ilthara Kessar gives them the same answer she gave her mother on the 9 steps, with a dead woman across her shoulders and her arms shaking, and nothing left in her voice at all. She says, "Because he did not put me down, and I was not going to put her down, and that is the whole of the law. Everything else we ever wrote was only a way of asking to be excused from it."